Hello, everyone, for being here. And after these big words we have heard in the plenary, you are already getting a sense that this is becoming a bit more technical now, I guess. So I think it's really about, how to translate this big vision that Sandrine, Jason, the president, and the others have outlined into action. So before I dive into the industrial policy, I just want to quickly comment on the context in which we find ourselves. So in the last century, the first goal of economic policy, and through that also of industrial policy, was how to grow the pie. And obviously, the secondary question was, as we see, how to distribute the pie and how to make it more sustainable and fit into the planetary boundaries. So today, in the 21st century, this is different. The first question is how to distribute the pie and how to make it more sustainable, because the pie is obviously, especially if you look at the global north, big enough. There is enough wealth. But how to get that, that's obviously not easy. Why? Because as the speakers before have outlined, it requires a fundamental reorganization and restructuring of the economy. And fundamental is really has a big scale. In the scale of industrial revolution, this is what we're talking about here. And this restructuring only happens, and this is where then capitalism kicks in, when we shift billions of investments to the right things. And I purposefully say shift, because there's a lot of money, there's a lot of wealth. It's just used for the wrong purposes. The good news is, and now I'm coming to the topic of industrial policy, that obviously industrial policy can help making these shifts. It can help because it can create trust. Trust that the clean technologies will be the future. And trust that it is worth for the private sector to also invest in that. And some of you might not like it here in the room because obviously I know, coming myself from degrowth, then you don't like that investors obviously want to make the investments pay off. But that's unfortunately the reality, or that is the reality we are in. And the side note is that we can also make sure that these investments pay off for the public. And this is, I think, then the other question. Trust is only one side of the medal. You have mentioned indicators. There's obviously a couple of other objectives that need to be achieved. On the one hand, and this is again, I think, for some maybe an uncomfortable truth, the production needs to be competitive. Because when we look at the past and look at the industries that Europe tried to build up, for example, the solar industry, then we see that we were good in creating the market. We paid the upfront costs that we needed to develop these technologies, but we didn't build up the industries. And the key question now is how can we actually use this momentum today to also build up the industries in Europe? The second is then obviously making sure that this production and these industries are aligned with the 21st century goals. So we want to make sure that the companies that receive the subsidies have the strongest social standards, that they respect planetary boundaries, and I'm not talking only about climate, but the bigger picture of planetary boundaries, and that they don't use the subsidies to only increase their profits. Because obviously that's a big risk, that you actually have profit capture through subsidies that you're channeling into the economy. And that's not easy. And now it becomes really a bit more technical, so I hope that's fine for everyone. And the reason for that is because currently the Parliament is discussing the proposal of the Commission on this Net Zero Industrial Act. So this is one of the few files where there's actually still room for making this proposal right, getting it right. So when we think of that particular piece of legislation, then I think it's crucial that the EU looks at the good practices that are out there. There have been countries globally that have successfully implemented industrial policy. South Korea, Japan, China, there are a lot of countries that have experience with that. And there are multiple things we can learn from that. We have recently published this 5-point plan for Europe's industrial policy. I invite every one of you to look at that. There's also a mini guide on Beyond Growth where this plan is also linked with a QR code. I will focus on 3 of those points. The first one is, let me see if this works. switching it on helps, I guess. So the first one is about complementing the idea that we need carrots, and it's working. I have just thanks. That we need carrots and incentives to complement that with sticks. So making sure that the industries go really in the right direction. So this is, on the one hand, this has two levels. On the one hand, we need to set performance-based goals for the performance of production. So how efficient is the company in producing heat pumps, in producing solar panels, and all the other technologies we need, right? Because obviously we want that these companies, once we take away the subsidies, are still able to stay in a globally competitive market. The other is how to support the industries that are having the best performance of the products. Because if you think of heat pumps, then if you look at, for example, some of the startups, then the heat pumps are to some extent 50% more efficient than some of the older ones. So how do you support those companies that are producing the most efficient products? As you know from energy, it's important how much energy heat pumps will be using, because the energy grid in Europe will depend on that. But then that's obviously only the technological performance. There's also the social and the sustainable performance. So on the social side, and Monica will say more on that, it's obviously crucial that the companies that receive the subsidies are not just creating jobs, but the question is what kind of jobs? Do they support tariff contracts? Do they support labor organization? Do they have gender and diversity plans in place? So these are the companies that should get the subsidies. And on sustainability, obviously, I think you've already mentioned most of the points. It's also crucial that those companies are not just using any resources, but also trying to actually implement the circular economy when they do that. And all of that, especially the social point, I want to stress that is important because of a political economy point of view. After we have launched the Green Deal now, the key question is how to keep up the momentum. And to get there, the key question is how to make it work for the people. And if you look at, for example, Central and Eastern Europe, if you look at vulnerable households that are not that well off, then obviously those social conditionalities and also the question where these industries actually emerge can help with getting that social buy-in. So first, only the companies that perform well on all of these goals should get the support. The next question is then how to make sure that the public also participates in these profits. The 20th century thinking is, okay, well, the public takes the risks and the profits are privatized. And I think that's obviously not what we want to have happen again. Instead, it might actually be worth considering how the member states can participate in the companies they support. So, for example, this is nothing radical, right? Because, for example, if you look at the French government, it owns 15% of Renault. The German government owns 12% of Volkswagen. So in the past, it was very, very okay that actually the state participates in companies. And interestingly, the state aid rules, they state, quote, state aid must be granted on terms that affords the state a reasonable remuneration, such as an appropriate share of future gains in the value of the beneficiary. That's part of the delegated act. So this is the legal basis. It's there. We just need to make sure it's really happening, because I'm missing that language in the Net Zero Industry Act for now. So I only had 5 minutes. I already took more than that, I guess. So there's a lot else to be said on this topic, and I hope in the discussion we can also talk about some of the other important issues. But let's take this as a start. To make sure industrial policy serves the goals of the 21st century, that's really the question here. We can learn from the past, and we need to bind subsidies to performance goals and make sure that the public participates in the profits. And looking forward to the discussion.